Hey, welcome to this Zmodeler primer. So I thought I'd just do this video to give one sort of convenient place people can go just to get the basics of Zmodeler without having to wade through hours and hours of those other longer video series like the Rhino modeling series, where you might have to, watch on for hours before you find out the tool you want to use. So I know that in Z Classroom there's an extensive kind of a list of videos on Zmodeler and all the basics, but I thought I'd just stick one up here anyway and show the most common tools that I would use. So I'm starting off here with a Q cube or a quick cube, which I have some of them on the UI here, and these can be found down in initialize here, and you have a cube, a sphere and a cylinder on the various axes, and then you can set the resolution. So basically these are just sort of optimized primitive shapes that you can get up and running quickly with Zmodeler. And just to note, if you have a regular sort of a ZBrush primitive active, then only the primitive initialize options will be available. The Zmodeler, those quick tools won't be available unless your active tool is a Polymesh 3D, which ZBrush primitives are not. Right, so back to this, and first things first, we'll talk about the terminology, I suppose, that you don't need to know, but I'm going to just use a sort of to explain things here. So you have your components, verts, edges and faces, or polys as they're called in ZBrush. So when you hover over either the tree, you're going to get an indication. The action, in this case Qmesh, a poly, and the component will show up, so you sort of know, as well as it being highlighted, you kind of know what you're going to be working on. So that's what you do. You hover over whichever component you want to affect, and then you press spacebar and hold it down, and then your actions will appear here in the top list, all the different actions, and then the target is whether it's going to be a single edge loop or multiple edge loops, and in this case the list will be bigger or smaller depending on what you're doing. So it might look a bit overwhelming at first, but it isn't really. It's quite simple when you get used to using it, and that's pretty much all you need to know for the basics of how it works. That's all there is really. You hover over your component, hold down the space bar, choose what you want to do. So in this case we'll say split, and we know that's a point up here, so split a point, and then you can, these modifiers here also obviously modify the behavior of what you're doing. So the best thing to do is, I'm not going to go over every single one of these, just way too many of them. So the best thing to do, and how when I first got my hands on Zmodeler, I just dived in and just tested everything out on simple sort of shapes to see what each one of them did. And because obviously I have a pretty long history modeling in 3D Max, I just wanted to know the equivalent tools such as chamfer, bevel, extrude and so on. So split point, and then you just hover over the point, click the left mouse and drag, and it'll interactively create this, which might look simple, but for people that have got traditional 3D modeling backgrounds, you'll understand how handy this is, because usually you'd chamfer a vert and it would give you a diamond, and then you'd have to cut these edges in and then create a kind of a geopoly shape to give you your circular shape. So when you subdivide it, it's going to be a circle, and generally 8 edges are going to give you a circle when you're subdivision modeling. Right, so that's just a basic example. So I'll get into more examples now. I'll show some more of the tools. So that was split point. And the other ones that I would use here, you can also, if you sometimes when you're working on denser meshes, you might have to zoom in really close to select your component. So it can be handy sometimes if you're just working on edges, we'll say, to just go to the face or poly mode and just say do nothing. Go to verts, do nothing, and now it's only operating. See, even when I'm over a vert, it's saying insert edge loop, over a face insert edge loop. So that's just a way to sort of isolate the component that you want to work on if it's annoying you. Then we have, say, slide point, where it'll slide and constrain. See, it's constraining to the surface, so you can't move it off the surface. And then there's also stitch, which is like a welding tool. So you can select the first point, select the second point. Now ZBrush n-gons are illegal, so it either won't let you create them or it'll just triangulate them. So just bear that in mind. So that's kind of basic welding tool. And then transpose can be a handy one. So it'll automatically mask everything else out. And bar that vert, and it'll switch it onto the transpose line. So now you could just hold shift in the center circle, and then that's going to be perfectly aligned to the surface normal of that vert. So that's a handy one. And just make sure to switch back to draw. Q is the hotkey. And also I forgot to mention, all important, the Zmodeler brush. I have it on my interface here obviously, but to get to it quickly, B for brush, Z for Zmodeler, and then M for the actual brush, and that'll bring you onto the brush. So they're the main sort of tools that I would use. I don't find myself using most of the other ones, but you can check them all out. But I generally only use those few for verts. So next we'll cover edges. So if I hover over an edge, the first one here that's highlighted, insert edge, you're just cutting in edge loops. So it's set the single edge loop. So every time you just click and hold down your mouse, a lot of the actions that you're going to do in Zmodeler, you'll hold down the mouse, and there's some interactive ones as well, but you'll hold down the mouse and drag. So now we can just interactively place that edge where we want it. So then there's insert multiple edge loops, and then our modifiers become available here. So interactive resolution, if I click, hold, and then start dragging up or down, it's going to give me consistently spaced edge loops interactively as I drag up and down. And then there's another one here that I find myself using a lot. I love it. It's you just switch this to interactive elevation, and now when I click, drag, hold, you can see that if I go left and right, it's going to pretty much move those verts out along the surface normals, and then up or down is going to give us those consistently spaced edge loops. So you can see where this might be a very handy tool. Bevel is the next one. So that's just like your bevel that you would get in your 3D package. And just bear in mind, just make sure your targets, you've edge loop complete, edge loop partial, and then a poly loop. So just make sure to understand the difference. So this is breaking here, because these are on these corners here, it's not a this is a pole here. This is it's called an end pole, where 3 edges converge at a vert, so that breaks the edge loop. So that's where edge loop partial is going to be useful, or not. And then you also have polyloop, and polyloop is, you can see, it's working perpendicular to the component that you have kind of targeted. So that's bevel. So bevel edge loop complete, I would, you know, be using most of the time. The next tool then we'll have a look at is I might as well move through. Well, mask is similar to with the transpose tool that we showed with the verts. So I'll go back there again and mask, edge, or any of these other ones, edge loop complete, partial and polyloop, and then I'll just click it. And now if I move with the transpose, that edge is masked, so obviously we can't move it, but you could then just control click to invert that mask, and then only move that edge, and Q to go back to draw. So transpose is the same as we showed with the vert, but it's going to, in this case, the average of the surface normals here is going to be automatically chosen, but it and will be switched to transpose, so that way then you can move it along that average surface normal. And remember, like, you can do these things with the transpose. One of the main vert tools, sorry, that I forgot to talk about was there's 2 different types of moving really that I would use. So there's the transpose sort of moving that you just saw, where I'll mask what I want to move, control click to invert it, and then move it about, and that's without having to go through the Zmodeler tools. So that's, you know, say for instance you want to move these in the middle, you can just drag your mask in the empty canvas, spacebar to move it in, mask, control click to invert the mask, and then this one was already masked, so I'll just clear the mask, control drag, spacebar, mask, control click to invert, and now that's what's going to be moving. So the other useful one that I forgot to show, sorry, Q to go back to Zmodeler, hover over a point, hold down spacebar and choose move, and by default it's a brush radius, so it's going to move based on the fall off your brush. But this infinite depth, what that's going to do, I'll just show brush radius first. If I use brush radius, you can see it didn't pick up that, because, you know, it's whatever's under the brush, and then influenced also by the fall off. So you can see now you get more freeform sort of movements just using move, and that's just similar to using the move brush, the regular ZBrush move brush. So infinite depth is basically going to still be affected by the radius of the brush, but if I move this now, you can see across an orthographic view in screen space, it's just going to infinitely, whatever's in the radius, kind of parallel to your view and your cursor, will be moved. So infinite depth is very handy if you're working on something, you know, orthographically, maybe from a reference, without having to transpose all the time. You can move stuff around. Now transpose moving is still very important, because it allows you to move stuff more accurately, because with the transpose line, if you, I'm holding shift, because I'm going to snap it then, and I know then I can always move orthographically and along an axis. Holding shift will stay in a straight line based on you know, where your axis is. so I can snap the axis holding shift, and now it's going to move along that axis. So back to edge again, Q to go into Zmodeler, and we've bridge two edges here, either edges or holes. So I'll show edges first. So it's essentially just the same as bridging in a 3D package. So first I'll have to hover over a poly and delete one. So let's say we have a hole here in the mesh and we want to bridge. We just click the first edge, click the second edge, and it's going to fill in that hole. So if I delete two polys, we can bridge them back in, and it's automatically going to weld on the corners here. And the next one, bridge two holes, and if I just Qmesh a single poly, I'll tag these, bring those out, tag these, bring those out. And let's say for instance we wanted a bridge that hole and that hole, so we just delete these faces and then bridge two holes, and then we can see here, click the first hole, click the second hole, and if I drag, that is the same that I showed earlier with the modifiers, interactive curvature, interactive resolution, and all these different options, and that's how you can bridge between two holes. So another interesting and useful tool. So I'll just undo, back to there, and those white polygroups there that you saw me create are very important. I use them all the time, and if you're used to 3D modeling, it's like selecting faces and then operating on those faces. So you just hold Alt and basically just paint, and then they're going to be affected. So even if I hover over that and say or I'll tell you what, actually I'll just paint three of them, and let's say this is a single polygroup. So if they're not tagged and I say Qmesh a polygroup island, it's going to only affect that polygroup island. But if I tag these and say Qmesh a polygroup island, it's going to ignore that one and only operate on the ones that I had tagged. So that's very useful. And then if you have tagged Alt and then you want to, you've inadvertently selected something you don't want in your selection, you can just hold Alt and that will get rid of it and change the polygroup. I'm going to talk about polygroups and the importance of working with them and using them to your advantage, because they're very advantageous in all things ZBrush, but particularly this sort of modeling. It allows you to speed everything up. So lastly I'll show that's pretty much you know, if insert edge loop, as we said. I'll just turn off interactive resolution, or just turn it back to single edge loop. And I just forgot to mention that the Alt modifier key will delete edge loops and then just click to bring them back in. So we'll continue on taking a look at more of the edge actions. So the next one we look at is close, and same thing here, we'll have to delete a poly, and you've got two different targets and also modifiers here depending on what type of hole. So this is just a basic hole, it's just a poly deleted. So depending on which target you have, it's going to close the hole with different topology. So if I delete all these, you can see there it's just pretty much left us with a sort of a polar cap here that you might get on a cylinder. And as I say, depending on the type of hole, if it's more complex, it'll close it up similar to a close holes operation. So next we'll take a look at a collapse, and this can be useful if you're rearranging topology. So that's interactive as well, depending on what you're doing and depending on the topology. It's gonna, you can go interactively move the mouse. So a better example might be if I split this vert, and then if I want to collapse the edge here, if you drag up or down, it's going to collapse it one way or the other. And crease is going to be very, very important if you're doing that type of modeling with creasing. So basically you can just crease, and this is extremely powerful now in R7, because before, to crease, you could never crease individual edges. Well, you'd have to do a lot of arsing around, hiding polygroups and all that. It used to be a bit of a nightmare, but now it's simple, because we can have ultimate control over creasing, because you can go in on a prepare edge level, crease, and then alt to uncrease, as it says there in the pop-up. Same thing again, edge loop partial complete, same as the other tool. So you can sort of see how a lot of the stuff, once you get used to some of these, it's going to be similar for a lot of the tools. Delete, obviously that's delete edge. You can extrude, edge loop complete, and you can see there the type of extrusion we get. Insert, we've seen inset edge is going to inset faces that are attached to that edge, and we also have some modifiers there, like inset region, so it's going to inset that as a single region rather than two individual polys. Mask we've seen, move we've pretty much seen as well, and these are similar to the vert move brushes. Polygroup, I'll look at that when we're doing the poly actions. Qmesh, you can extrude an edge basically in that fashion, which can come in handy. I'm going to look at Qmesh, which I'll be using sort of for the bulkier work when doing Zmodeler. Scale is going to scale based on the same targets here, so it's just going to basically scale it uniformly along the normal direction. Slide, same as the vert slide. Spin is going to just same thing. If you're, sorry, I had a crash there. So spin edge was the last thing we looked at. If you're rearranging topology, you can see where that might be useful. Split is going to split the edge up, and same thing, it's giving you a polar vert here. Then we have stitch, and that also requires a deleted face, so I don't really, some of these I don't really use. Swivel is similar to scale, so swivel edge loop, and it's just swiveling around a point. In this case, all these verts it's anchoring to, but if you do it on here, you'll see that it's pivoting off this edge. Which can be handy to get certain shapes or forms. So that's pretty much all the edge tools. Now we'll have a look at the poly tools. So yeah, we've seen delete and bevel, and then the main thing with the poly tools here, these targets, you're going to use these all the time. So single poly, all polygons, quads, triangles, blah blah blah, it goes through them. So like a flat island, for instance, I'll go to Qmesh, a flat island, so drag and hold, and it's going to, you can see it's based on the surface normals as well, so the angle is 0, so it's considered a flat island. And the difference between that and Polygroup Island should be quite obvious, but it's not going to do that because it's selecting all those polys associated with that polygroup. And then another very handy one is Polyloop. And you can see here, whenever I'm hovering over a face, and this little orange kind of widget pops up, and that's sort of a directionality indicator. So if I say Qmesh a Polyloop, it's going to Qmesh around that continuous edge loop, because you know I have the little orange widget pointing in the direction I want to go. So similarly, it's going to do it from there. And then you can check all these other ones out. So you might find yourself using I do anyway, Polygroup All and Polyloop, a single poly, which was what I showed earlier, where you could alt click to tag faces, and then the operation will be isolated to those. It's a temporary polygroup, that white polygroup. You know, if you had a load of triangles and whatever mesh, I'll say a load of cylinders with polar caps, you could just say delete and then all triangles, and then it'll just delete all the triangles in one go. Then you also have Polygroup All. So if I have you know, multiple polygroups in different parts of the mesh but the same color, it'll work on all them. So say for instance I did a split here, and then if you just click after doing an operation, it'll repeat that last exact same with the same settings. So I click there, and there, and then I want to Qmesh these out in. I can go to Polygroup All, and now it's going to do it on all those polygroups at the same time. So I don't have to do them individually. Even though doing them individually, if I just went to Polygroup Island, you can also do that repeat last. So if I drag that one out and then just click, it's going to repeat the last action. And also along those same lines, you could Qmesh out and then just click, and you're going to get the exact same extrusion. So we'll just undo those holes. And the bread and butter really is Qmesh. So if I just go to single poly, there's a lot of different modifiers and stuff here that you can check them out and see this weak attraction, no attraction. And it also is dependent on your brush size, because this is one thing that Qmesh does, which is pretty great, is that it automatically creates these you know, and if you're doing this in your 3D package, you'd have to weld these verts and everything, but Qmesh automatically does that, and you can see it's going up in steps. And the effect based on the brush size is changing. You can see when I had a smaller brush. And you can also change this down here, 10th step, half step, quarter step, to kind of snap it. You can see there it's snapping. We drop the brush size down, it's snapping now. The inner edge is connecting, and then this is snapping in increments based on that setting there. These different steps. So a line 10th step, it's going to go up 10 steps before it catches up and flattens out. So, you know, Qmesh is, as I say, the bread and butter brush, and there's a couple of key modifiers. If you start Qmeshing and hold down shift, rather than extrude, it's going to just move it along that surface normal. And this one's obviously coming along because it's attached here by this edge. Now if you start dragging and hold control, you can break that away to its own face, and then you can just Qmesh these and it'll snap together automatically. So that's quite handy there, the whole control and shift with the modifier keys while you're working. So that's Qmesh, and you can see it's very handy for, let's say, split a hole there and then just click for the exact same size hole, Alt to tag those faces, and then if I start Qmeshing in, you'll see it's snapped to the other one, and now we have a nice hole in the mesh. So Qmesh extrudes out along its surface normal, but a handy trick is the older way of extruding in ZBrush before we had Zmodeler was you could just mask a single poly, invert the mask, and move transpose, and then we can drag out our transpose line holding shift, and now if we control shift drag, we can extrude out along our transpose line rather than along the normals. So that is the older way of so wherever I put that transpose line and then shift drag the middle circle, sorry, control shift drag, it's going to extrude out along that transpose line. So that's Qmesh in a nutshell, pretty much. Q to go back to draw mode, and we've got scale a poly, and I'll tag them, and we can scale them all together, and then you see you have your same targets, and then it's going to scale from different sort of pivots. Spherize gives you a sort of a geopoly, which can also be useful. Spin is just going to rotate them on these, using these verts as a kind of a pivot, and split a poly. It's split that in four. It's quadded it or subdivided that single face, but then it's also has also had to create this extra topology to avoid n-gons like I was talking about earlier on. So it's almost like a local sort of a subdivision. Insert Nanomesh is going to be important if you're using Nanomesh brushes. So Polygroup Island, if you start dragging, that's the default Nanomesh. It's just a cube, and it's based on that Polygroup Island. So if I was to go to all polygons, now it's going to give me a Nanomesh on every single poly. So if you have any Nanomesh, any brush at all, any insert brush that you want to use, you see Nanomesh becomes active here. You can just choose whatever Nanomesh brush, and to create a Nanomesh brush you just go to brush, create insert mesh, and then from that insert mesh create Nanomesh brush, and that'll create a new Zmodeler brush. So let me just demonstrate that. So let's say I'll just create this as an insert brush. Brush, create insert brush, new brush, create Nanomesh brush, and you can see it's created a Zmodeler brush, but is actually a Nanomesh. So Nanomesh, all polygons, because I didn't align this to the canvas, and that's why it's coming out like that. But that's quickly how to create a Nanomesh brush. So it's creating a Zmodeler brush with that as your Nanomesh, and you can also append and then have multi kind of meshes. And next we mesh the brush, which is just going to turn your mesh into a brush. Inset, so I'm going to just say inset Polygroup Island And then if we start insetting, the same as with the edge, it's going to inset that polygroup island, each face individually. Come down to inset region, polygroup island, and inset them together as a region. And just inset them again, and look at polygroup, and then you can I use this a lot, so I can polygroup different targets. So say polyloop, so I can change these to the same polygroup. And whenever you just click a polygroup, if you click and hold down the button and then press Alt, you can cycle through different polygroup colors. There's Qmesh, scale, spherize, spin, crease. So you can crease a single poly, and the border edges of that polygon, or the faces bordering it, will be creased. You could also then crease polygroup island, and if you change your modifier, so you want to change that to outer targets, and that will only crease the border polygons of that polygroup island. So another handy thing you can do is essentially copy and paste polygroups based on these targets. So I'm just going to select single poly, and if you click and hold and then tap shift and then click on another one, you can essentially copy and paste those polygroups between polys. So that'll then be the active polygroup color. So if I click over here, you can see it's changed to that, but I can tap to bring it back to what it was, and then copy that one back to there. So it'll take a couple of times just to if you practice that, I find it quite useful. So remember, the polygroup you want to copy, you just go to polygroup, a single poly, or whichever it is you need. So polyloop, for instance, and then you just click and hold, tap shift, and then click to paste it. So remember, when you click it, it's going to turn to the color of the active polygroup, but then if you tap shift, it's going to copy that one to the clipboard and leave it as what it was, and then you can just paste that around the place. So try that out a couple of times, quite useful. So I think I'm going to leave it at that, because I don't want this to run on way too long. People just get pissed off, and it's sort of it's just too much to kind of wade through the video, I suppose. But having watched this, you know, you're ready to go. It's pretty simple to use, and if you're familiar with poly modeling tool sets already, a piece of piss. So the main thing, and it's how I, as I said, when I got my hands on it, learned it, was just to start off with just basic geometry or whatever, and just take an hour or two in an afternoon or whatever on a hungover Saturday or Sunday, and just mess around with it. You know, get used to all these, and then the modifiers. Like, a lot of the time I won't use a lot of these because the basic sort of stuff I'm showing here is mostly what I'll use while I'm creating things, unless I need something really specific. So that's pretty much it, and I hope this was helpful, and I'll see you in the next one. Alright, cheers, thanks, good luck.